it would be Huang. You have the H sound.
Really?
Yes. So anybody that you come across with a surname called Huang is actually a Wang.
Really? That's
Yes.
really interesting.
We're part of the four great families in China. It's a Wang, Li, Chan, and I think it's Lim.
Okay. So speaking of China, you came across to the U.S. when you were 5 years old, if I'm correct, reading your
Well,
biography.
actually, I left China. I was really born right into the Maoist revolution, and I spent the first 5 years of my life there, behind the Iron Curtain, so to speak. And it was a life of really, a great deprivation and scarcity because, in times of war and revolution, it's really the common people who really suffer. There was mass starvation and famine. Um, and I don't even know how I survived, but one of the ways that it happened is that my beloved little grandmother would chase rats around the house to feed me with. And my mother was in charge of, cutting wood in the field. So sometimes she would take, she would trap little field mice and bring home, field mice, and we would pan fry them, and that would be a yummy dinner. So
Really?
it sounds really gross, but that's really the way it happened. And so I spent the first 5 years of my life there. And then when I was 5 years old, my mother took a huge leap of faith, and she was very courageous, and she bribed the border guard with her wedding jewels sewn into a little pillow. And I remember, holding that pillow, close to my chest. And she said, "There's something very important there, so you must be, guarding it very, very carefully." But that's what she did. And the border guard released us to our freedom in Hong Kong, where we were had relatives waiting for us. And and
It's okay.
sorry, and so we had relatives waiting on the other side of the border for us, and they took us into safety and basically kept us safe until my father was able to send my mother some money, and she bought a flat in Hong Kong, in the Hung Ham district, on the mainland side of Hong Kong. And, then he petitioned us about a year later to come to America. And that was really a minor miracle because this was, like in the mid 50s. And it was really the height of the McCarthy, paranoia scare period. And, I think it was just really a miracle that my mother and I were able to join my father. I had never met my father in my entire life, so this was a really first encounter. And unfortunately, he rejected me because I was the firstborn daughter instead of the firstborn son. So that kind of really gave me a psychological, you might say, complex. And, so I had to really work extra hard to really win his approval for the rest of my life. And so that's why I became such a huge overachiever and accomplisher in my life.
There's a lot of hardship in that story, but if you really look down at it, it's what the American dream used to be, in my mind. It used to, and I say used to because the world's changing a little bit. There was a time when America was the greatest country in the world, and don't get me wrong, it still has a lot of great qualities, but there was a time when everyone on the planet wanted to come to America so they could live in the Golden Palace, if that makes sense.
I think they still do. I still think, many people in the world, no matter how we are criticized here in America, they still see it as the promised land, the place where, dreams can really come true. And, without, we can live a life without oppression and freedom. And I think, America was really, built on pioneers and immigrants such as my parents and even myself. And as a matter of fact, my whole family lineage really goes back to the 1800s during the gold rush era when my great great grandfather came to this country and worked on the railroads in Sacramento. And, so he's really a part of Chinese history who contributed to the building of this great country by connecting the East Coast with the West Coast. And that changed everything, of course. So, on the backs of the Chinese people, there was a lot of sacrifice, and if you just really, excavate underneath those railroad tracks, you will see the bones of many Chinese men who really died, along the way to really make this happen and to make this great country, what it is today. And
So
actually,
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
And actually, to just really let you know a little bit of my ancestry, I'm from the Taishan Guangdong region of southern China. And, and historically, well, the old capital used to be called Canton, but now it's called Guangzhou, of course. And I was born in a very remote, sleepy, almost 16th century Chinese village, about 200 miles, I would say, southeast of Guangzhou, and it was just very, very primitive, and that's really my background. But anyway, the Taishan region where I came from basically produced the first Chinese settlers in this country, and they came in the mid 1800s already. And they became the launders and the cooks on the Chinese railroads. And, eventually they opened up grocery stores and all that sort of thing. And my own father, he, basically followed the lineage of some of his predecessors and became a launderer. And, so I grew up, living above a Chinese hand laundry in Culver City, which was really, sort of this pristine, white suburbia, back in the early 60s. So, it's been a very interesting thing, but, immigrants really built this country, and we are really what make this country great, the diversity, the melting pot, and the fact that you can still make it here in America, land of the free, home of the brave. So it's a great thing, America.
So I wasn't trying to badmouth America in any way, shape, or form. I'm Canadian personally, so I see things from a different perspective. To be honest, my country's fantastic. I love it here, and I'm sure you guys love it in the South too. The thing that interests me about your story, Sue's a fashion designer, for those of you that watch and don't know, but
for many years.
We'll talk about the fashion design in a little bit. I want to talk about who you are and the experiences you've had. Do you think that, I know for a fact, but the progression you've seen in the history of America and Western culture in general, in the 1960s, people didn't know a lot about what the Chinese people did for the country. It was very hidden because it was the launderers and things like that, if that makes sense. It was almost like Mexicans are today, as they're the side workers of real industry. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to be offensive with that, but it wasn't known what the Chinese people were doing for the country back then very well.
And there was a lot of discrimination and persecution. I was in this movie called The Jade Pendant, where I really had a minor role playing the mother-in-law of the son who married the heroine. But basically it centers around in 1871. I think it was really in October of 1871 that the most heinous and horrible massacre and lynching occurred in this country. And it wasn't in the South against blacks. It was really right here in Los Angeles, Chinatown, Los Angeles of 1871, where they really brutally lynched and killed 19 Chinese women, children, and men. So, and then they torched Chinatown. It was just really a hate crime. And today you still really have that perpetuated because, because of the COVID, pandemic, the Chinese people, and unfortunately, most Asians are really being outed and attacked while they're really, going out in the streets. It kind of reminds me of the story that my father would really tell me when he was a young man and in this country. He had just arrived in 1940, and of course in 1941 the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor. So after that there was just really a yellow peril hate thing going on with everybody. And he's used to really tell me of the fact that the Chinese had to wear placards or like posters on their back saying I'm Chinese, not Japanese, because they would really be attacked or beaten up or spat on or egged or rocked or stoned, all that kind of stuff. And you have the same stupidity and ignorance going on today in society because we are not the Chinese government, but they really throw us into the whole bag. Just because the Chinese government made some unconscious choices, and I really don't support what the Chinese government did, to the world at all. And I think they should be held accountable. There should be a solidarity and stand, with the whole world to really, make them, pay for their, and have accountability for their transgressions. But by the same token, I just really don't think that it's really fair for all Asians to be attacked because we are not the coronavirus. We are not, the Chinese government. And I think, this hatred and, and crime that people commit against each other is just really horrific. And it's just really based on ignorance and barbaric, traditions, I guess, and it's all very unconscious.
So, Sue, I'm going to be honest. I had no idea that stuff was happening today. As a white person, I did not realize that there's some, we'll call it a movement against Asians in general because of COVID. That's insane.
Not only happening here in this country, it's happening worldwide. It's happening in Germany. It's happening in France. It's happening in the UK. It's happening, everywhere, because people are really ignorant. They should really have a fine separation between, the perpetrators, which is really, the Chinese government is really at fault, but not, all Asian people. It kind of reminds me, the time when 911 happened and, all the Sikhs, were being attacked, out in the street just because they wore turbans. But people are really, just incredibly brutal and primitive, at a very sort of visceral level. These Sikhs really have nothing to do with terrorists, or they're not even Muslims. They're an Indian sect of Hinduism. So it's just really crazy, But people are what they are. They are primitive. They have, barbaric urges. And, it's always easier to really pin blame on somebody instead of really fully investigating what the truth really is.
So how do we change? This went in a real odd direction. I was planning on talking to you about fashion design and all that stuff, but how do we as let's take a big example. Let's say you're one people and I'm another people. As white people, how do white people begin to combat it and Asian people begin to combat this? So instead of seeing ourselves as different people, we become one people.
I think we have to really take a good look at our humanity and what really matters, and instead of really a great divide, hopefully what this virus, has done, on a global level, because it is a global pandemic, is really, changed the consciousness of people, and that, we are one humanity. Just because the color of our skin or, the differences in our religion doesn't really make us separate. We are all the same. So we just really have to be more compassionate, more kind. And, maybe, this virus has a transcendent function to really change the, consciousness of humanity. And, we can only hope for a better world and more consciousness and on the, on the parts of people out there, and not really resort to brutality or violence or pure ignorance. Go get yourself an education, become a better human being.
Some people don't want people to get educations, so that might be part of the problem.
Well, that's true. It's really, been gradually, maybe if there's a decline of the great American civilization, is that, there's a decline in the quality of education. Because when I was really in high school, we were reading Shakespeare, we were reading the French existentialist philosophers, such as Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre and Franz Kafka, who wasn't French, but he was nevertheless in that school. And you just really see the deterioration and the decline in in the interest on the part of young people. And I think part of it is really the problem of society, because it's more important that a basketball star gets paid $50 million a year, but then qualified educators who are really great at that role don't want to be educators because they're paid a meager salary and they have to struggle to feed their families. So I think people in this country really they have this their priorities all wrong. Now, I hate to really say it, but, by the same measure, in my old mother country, China, you go to China, and it's very impressive because, they have bookstores that are like 4 stories high, full of young people packed in there reading, being intellectually curious about the world, about everything. And now the kids in this country, all they really want to do is play computer games, So that's a different sort of mindset, I would say, and a different priority.
Does that stem from the Mao days where people weren't allowed to do anything, and now they have some freedom, not real freedom?
Some freedom, but you have to understand that it's still a totalitarian state. When you go to a place like Shanghai or Beijing, you walk along the street and there are cameras pointed at you everywhere. So Big Brother is watching big time, So, and I would say, the Chinese government, the Chinese communist government, they really have done a great job in basically feeding the masses, so no longer there is starvation. They have built really great, beautiful modern cities that really put our cities here to shame. They have none of this urban blight with the homeless that we do. So America does have to step up and really, become more socially responsible and socially conscious, So, but they just really, have built this really great, force and might of economic power. So no longer the people are starving, but in exchange, I feel very sad for, my Chinese people, because they basically kind of stole the soul of China, away. And, all this ancient culture of beauty and philosophy of Taoism and Buddhism and Confucianism, it's all been really replaced by the money god. So everybody's very materialistic there, and the spirituality has really been wiped off the slate. When I was in China as a child, they commandeered our old Taoist temple, which was really at the front of the village, and they basically made that into party headquarters, and they took all the icons from the altars and they smashed them and threw them in the pond. All the books were, burned. And anything that had to do with the old basically was, demolished and destroyed. So can you imagine all the beautiful, ancient antiquities completely destroyed? And, they wanted to eradicate, 5,000 years of beautiful, culture and everything. And I have to say, thank God for, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, because they basically hauled off vessels of China's biggest treasures. And now it's really sitting in the National, Museum in Taipei. And now the communist government wants it all back. Well, you should have really, taken to preserve all that beauty in the first place, not destroy it. So anyway, I'm sorry I had to really get on my little soapbox this morning.
No. Here's the thing about my show. I don't care what we talk about as long as it has a connection. And while you speak, I can feel the feeling coming through you. It's amazing to talk to somebody that actually shows emotion and real emotion, if that makes sense. A lot of people are so tight and they're so worried about the world that they don't let things out.
And not only that, I lived through all this stuff. I was a child of the revolution, so I was really there to really witness it. And I've been back to China many times since then. And I really have witnessed, the great building of the, People's Republic of China and all these powerful, modernistic, beautiful cities that they, built. But then don't forget, they really did it at the back of the people, because don't forget that the Chinese government basically stole all the wealth from the people. Everybody was required to really surrender over their personal belongings. Even our cooking utensils, after a while, we were not allowed to cook at our homes anymore. We had to really eat out of the common mess hall, which was the temple. And at the end of the day, you were rationed a bowl of, rice and some vegetables. And, there was no meat. There was just so much scarcity. And that was it.
So I want to do a turn. Thank you for telling your story, because a lot of people are afraid of it. I want to do a turn.
That's only a small part of my story. So
I know.
Hear the rest of it, you have to have me back sometimes.
Well, I will definitely have you back.
Thank you.
We are coming close to the end. We're at 22 minutes. We got about 6 minutes left, if that's okay.
Sure.
I want to ask you about you and what you've done since then. So you're a fashion designer, and from what I'm told, you are a mix between modern and romantic from the bio I was reading. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it means that I basically really cross over to many different genres in terms of my style. I have a really deep understanding of style. So design-wise, I have a huge range. And I like to really think of myself as a, very expansive human being that just really embraces a lot of different things into my world. So, my clothes have really been, beautifully romantic and sort of evocative of the 1920s and 1930s. And we're sitting here at my home, the Cedars, which is a historical residence, which I really want to, bequeath to my legacy foundation. I'm forming the Sue Wong Legacy Foundation, and the Cedars will be really part of my legacy, because I'm going to make it into a museum of living golden Hollywood history. And I have archived about 11,000 pieces of my work, and I want to start the Sue Wong Fashion Museum so that it can really be a exchange program, a residency program for aspiring designers from all over the world. And I would really make available to them my vast library of sketches and swatches, and I think that's really a tremendous legacy to leave behind.
Well, hopefully you're not leaving too soon, because I really want to have you on again. Now I have two questions that are not connected to anything. Normally I do an icebreaker question, and people tell me it's the favorite part of the show. So the icebreaker question this week, we were supposed to do it at the beginning, but we would hop right in. If you could choose to eat any sandwich in the world for the rest of your life, but only that sandwich, what sandwich would it be?
Oh boy, that's pretty difficult. It would be, it would be a cross between a Reuben grilled on rye bread and just really a good old-fashioned hamburger.
Really? That sounds fantastic. And the last question I have for you before we actually end this off, Sue, I want to thank you. Where can people find you, number one?
Yes, they can find me on Facebook and Instagram under Sue Wong Fashion. And, I have a very vivid, colorful Facebook page. I call it the Sue Wong Magazine Daily. And I post, things on beauty is totally visual, philosophy, spirituality, architecture, fashion, art, all the things that really float my boat.
I went to your Facebook page and I saw your cover photo thing at the top, and that dress is stunning. I know I'm a fat white dude, but I have a little fashion sense. Not much you can see, but a little bit. It was beautiful. The last question I always ask everybody is, we're all locked up in this COVID time, blah, 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 all that stuff. That stuff doesn't really matter. The question I have is, what's one thing you've done for yourself? Not for anybody else, but for yourself today that's made you happy? And not this interview. You can't say the interview.
Well, I basically, am a dreamer, and I like to really, stay focused on my vision of what I want to accomplish. And right now, I'm really focusing on the first Sue Wong designer signature home. And I just bought this really beautiful 1928 hacienda, which I'm going to really refurbish and redesign, and it's going to be brilliant. So I'm all about visions and manifesting them and making one's dreams come true.
That makes sense. Every time I talk to a creative person, it's usually a creative outlet. I'm talking to money people, it's a money outlet. So I like talking to the creatives because they talk about their creative endeavors, which is where I get happy, is the creative stuff. So
absolutely.
Sue, that's the end of the interview. I just need you to say bye to our one watcher. There'll be more later, but bye one person, and we'll end it off.
And thank you for having me on the Jesse Lewis Show. I really
thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you.